This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
What is the number one tool you need to create sustainable self-care that makes you feel good, not guilty? It's free, it's accessible, and you probably have it and just don't know it yet. What is it? It's your intuition. Welcome to From Guilt to Good, Self-Care Solutions for Busy Caregivers, the podcast rewriting the narrative of self-care. If you're a caregiver feeling stretched thin, torn between responsibilities, and longing for self-care, you're in the right place. I'm Jeanette Yates, a fellow caregiver and someone who spent years doing all the self-care things and never feeling any better. After years of research, self-exploration, and trial and error, I finally found a way to create a sustainable self-care practice that made me feel good, not guilty. In today's episode, we are talking about how I did that through intuition, which I believe is our most powerful self-care tool. Okay, so we all know the word intuition. We all probably have an idea of what it is, but I looked it up for us, and the definition of intuition is that it is a form of knowledge that shows up without much effort on our part. Intuition also is, as my friend and intuitive eating counselor Shelly Najjar says, is about internal cues versus external rules. So when she talks about it in terms of intuitive eating, it's about accessing your internal cues for what to eat, when to eat, how to eat, versus society's rules that are placed upon us about doing those things. And taking that same thought process, we can put that into our self-care. So instead of doing self-care things how the world tells us to do them, we can do self-care things. First of all, we get to choose what our self-care is. And second of all, we get to choose how, when, and why to do it. And so we want to learn how to create a self-care practice based on internal cues. That I think is the most important thing that we can do and our biggest asset and greatest tool in self-care. And here's how I think it works. So I don't know if you're like me, but I have done all the self-care things. I have, if there's an article, a magazine article, I remember after the birth of my kids, I read every article about, getting back into shape and taking care of yourself, and everything that was recommended, I tried. I wanted to do everything I could to take care of myself, but I wasn't really asking myself what that meant. I just was doing what the article said. So according to the articles, taking care of myself meant losing weight or eating a certain type of food or getting certain types of exercise. And that is what I focused on, even though I really wasn't asking myself, am I enjoying this? Do I feel better because I'm doing this? Is this something that I can keep doing for the long term? Self-care has to be sustainable. It has to be with you through the long haul. You have to take care of yourself in some way from now until the end, right? And then, of course, as caregivers, we know that at some point, you're probably going to need help taking care of yourself. And that's what we as caregivers do. But it still doesn't negate our own need for self-care. So when we think about using our intuition and self-care, we really want to turn into internal cues for basing our self-care practices. So first of all, the question is, do you even know why you define self-care the way you define it. So if I ask you to define self-care, like what does self-care mean to you? What would you say? And then if you write that down or you think about what you think that is, then I'm going to ask you, why do you think those particular things? So a lot of times when I'm working with a caregiver client for coaching, I will ask them like, well, what is your definition right now of self-care? What is it? And sometimes they'll say, well, it's time to myself. It's time where I get to do what I want. It's sometimes they mention some of those more quote, fun activities where it's like a massage or a facial or a day at the beach. And then other times they mention like exercise or eating, quote, better or something like that. But then when I ask them why they think that, why they think that that is self-care, usually it points back to something they've learned at some point throughout their life. So maybe when they were in school and they had health class, they learned that exercise and the proper diet is the right thing. And so therefore that's what self-care is. Or according to everything we see out there right now, self-care, always has something to do with your hair up in a towel and like cucumbers on your eyes, right? So like that's self-care, right? But if we really tap into what self-care really means, so if we think about those two words, self-care, what do they mean? It means caring for yourself. So then by default, you have to say, well, what exactly does myself need as far as care goes? So like when you think about like your loved one's need for caregiving, you assess what they need. And sometimes we get medical advice that tells us what care we need. And then sometimes it's like, well, everybody needs food, shelter, water, sleep. So we know these things. But when we're looking at ourselves, we also need to ask that same question. So what do we need to care for ourselves? What is our self telling us? What is our intuition telling us about what we need? So that would be the first step in tapping into your intuition. Now, in my framework that I teach inside my program, Empowered Self-Caregiver, we talk a lot about some of the pitfalls of that plan of tapping into your intuition, because a lot of times as caregivers or as parents or as people who are really busy, we've learned to like tamp down that voice that tells us we need to rest or we need to stop or we need to change something, right? Because we've got to keep going. We've got to push past our fatigue because we've got to get this done, or someone else needs us, or, we need to make sure that this is taken care of. And so we've learned to turn down that intuition inside us, turn down what our body is telling us. And usually we don't listen until it's screaming, which is when burnout happens, injury happens, or some other kind of, illness happens upon us that we're forced to listen to what our body has been trying to tell us through our intuition. And so that's why I think it's so important to, as you're learning to create your sustainable self-care plan, you really want to tap in to what your body is telling you. And the way to do that is to start practicing listening to your body. And that is really hard sometimes for people to do, especially when you're in the habit of listening to what everybody else needs. You don't have time to listen to yourself. And so I often recommend starting with some mindfulness practice, some breath work practice, just connecting your thoughts to your breath, your presence to your breath, your body and your breath. When you're doing that, it is the first step to opening up that listening portal, if you will, to your intuition. And so in the show notes today, I've added a little mindfulness workbook to help you with just some beginning mindfulness strategies, just starting from the very first thing. So if you're like, oh no, I don't have time for that, everything is 5 minutes or less, just take a look at that and start checking in with yourself in that way. Now, for those of you who are like, oh, I already know what my body is telling me. My stomach hurts all the time. I'm tired. I have a pain in, my shoulders and neck. And all of those things is your body actually telling you, and it's telling you something. And so your intuition, if you really were to tap into that, like, my stomach is hurting. And if we don't have intuition, we might want to blame this on, maybe just something that we ate, right? But if we're really listening, if we're really starting to become more self-aware, if we're really tapping into our intuition, we might be able to dig a little bit deeper into that. And maybe it's not about what we eat, but how we eat. Or maybe it's not about the food at all, but something else altogether. This is not an episode about gut health, so I won't go all into that. But I do have some people coming on in some episodes later this year talking about gut health and how it's all connected to our nervous system and all of that kind of stuff. But so suffice it to say, though, your body, your mind, yourself is talking to you, and learning to tap into that intuition is the first step, and probably the most important step, into creating a sustainable self-care practice. Because one of the things about any kind of self-care practice that happens is we get into a routine and then we just stick to it. It's like, if we happen to be so fortunate to be able to find a routine that we enjoy and we like it and we have it, and we stick to it, but then our needs change as we age, as different things happen in our lives, our needs are going to change. But if we're not tapped into our intuition, if we're not listening into what our mind and body is telling us we need, you're going to keep doing that routine even when it no longer serves you, even when it's no longer what your body is telling you that it needs. And so that is why, in order to create a sustainable self-care practice, one that can be adjustable and flexible, we have got to learn to tap into our intuition, to listen to our bodies, to listen to our minds, to feel our emotions and understand more about them. And so another thing that can be hard about that. So first of all, like, we're just ignoring it because we don't have time, right? But the second thing that can be really hard about that is that maybe it's really hard to sit with our feelings and to sit with our bodies. Maybe we have some stuff in our past that when we do get quiet and we do sit and we do listen, we don't like what it's saying. And that can be really hard too, which is why in the coming episodes, I'm going to be talking to some of my friends who are in the mental health field, and we're going to be talking into that difficult space. So what happens when we can't quite get to our intuition, or when we do get to that inner voice, we don't want to listen because it is too difficult. And so by response, our body turns it back down, right? And so I'm going to be inviting some of my friends on to talk a little bit about some ways that we can get through that, some ways that we can learn to sit in the discomfort, some ways that we can learn to move through the discomfort so that we can truly access that intuition, that self-awareness, to be able to create that sustainable self-care practice that is going to make us feel good, not guilty, because our body and our mind is always out to protect us. So we want to make sure that we are protecting it as well, and our bodies and our minds as well. So that is what we're going to be working on in the next couple of episodes. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some strategies and some different types of therapies that might be helpful if you're having one of those situations where tapping into your intuition, tapping into your inner voice is difficult, and you know that you're going to need help with that. Or maybe you want to just know more about that. So that's what we're going to be working on. But in the meantime, if you want to start trying to listen to what your body needs, and you want to start trying to practice a little bit of mindfulness, please check out the show notes, because I have the little mindfulness workbook in there for you. You can download it and get started on some 5-minute mindfulness practices that'll really help you start to listen, start to be quiet enough to listen to what your body is saying. And that is the first step to sustainable self-care. Thank you for joining me today. From Guilt to Good podcast is a proud member of the Whole Care Podcast Network. To access additional self-care resources that'll help you feel good, not guilty, check out the show notes and head to theselfcaregiver.com. Subscribe now and join me in going from guilt to good as you rediscover your worth, reclaim your health, and get back the life that you've been too busy or exhausted to enjoy. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback matters. We're redefining self-care for caregivers one episode at a time. And until next time, remember that you are worthy of the same care you give others. Thank you.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.